To the talk, Cambridge Growth Beyond Reason. Cambridge and our neighbours have experienced high rates of economic growth for decades. The infrastructure essential to a decent quality of life has not kept pace. High house prices and rents have driven middle income and poor households out of the city, swelling traffic congestion as they commute back to work, including key workers on who we depend. Pollution levels remain stubbornly high in parts of the city with harmful effects. Natural resources are under great strain, and in the case of water, could run out. These adverse effects significantly outweigh the benefits of high-value economic prosperity with its more intense inequality between an echelon of high earners and other citizens. Yet, we are urged by powerful voices to increase our rate of growth, to double its product over the next 30 years, lest we fail to satisfy the demands of the digital and life sciences industries, with the threat of their departure abroad, seen by the government as a threat to national economic growth. It explicitly says that. These powerful voices are led by the government and Mayor James Palmer. The devolution deal, which created the combined authority and its mayor, commits all of our local councils to this high level of growth, including the two responsible for the new local plan, which is under review at the moment. Cambridge Ahead, the strong and well-funded commercial pressure group within the city, is another influential advocate. This accelerated growth is not possible without great harm to Cambridge and our near neighbours. Harm through even higher housing costs, increased traffic congestion and delay, even more unreliable public transport, environmental pollution, exacerbating the climate emergency, yet more, quotes, densification within Cambridge itself, such as the threatened development of St Matthew's Piece, destruction of large parts of the Green Belt, which according to our current local plan is essential to the special character of Cambridge and our neighbouring villages, plus excessive strain on our health, education and other social infrastructure. The least well off and able to cope would suffer most. This threat is very real and close to us. According to the local transport plan, all of the, quotes, 6 key districts where this growth is expected to be, quotes, disproportionately located, quotes, are on our doorstep in Cambridge. And that includes Cambridge City Centre, Cambridge Station, CB1 and Hills Road, the Cambridge Biomedical Campus and others. Remember, this is on top of an already high rate of growth. I think many people don't understand this. Jobs in Greater Cambridge increased by 1/3 between the year 2000 and 2018, and by 1/4 from 2012 to 2018. That is by an additional 7,000 jobs each year over the last 6 years. If the annual rate of the last 6 years was to be repeated up to 2040, that's the end date of the new local plan, an additional 154,000 jobs would have been created since 2018. That is an increase to a total of 370,000, or more than double the number of jobs in 2000. This would be absurd were it not a logical consequence of where we are now. And according to the first conversation, which is the first shot consultation document in the preparation of the new local plan, there are already another 135 hectares of land in Greater Cambridge, that's Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire, allocated and available for economic development, including, for example, the land in one of the 6 key districts off Hills Road on which the Flying Pig stands, currently the subject of a planning application for 580,000 square feet of office space. That is an 84% increase on the space already provided and permitted in Station Road. Just to give you an order of it, 135 hectares is equivalent to 2.7 million square meters or 14.5 million square feet. So it's a massive amount already allocated and available. It is this seemingly uncontrolled economic growth which is driving the unsustainable pressure for growth in housing, physical and social infrastructure, and in the traffic congestion and pollution. COVID's reduction in the latter is temporary, not permanent. Many jobs in our area and elsewhere cannot be done wholly remotely, nor is it healthy for workers to do so. Also, witness the fact that, quotes, road traffic congestion in outer London is now far higher than it was last year, according to Fiona Harvey in a recent issue of The Guardian. Hopefully, the reduction in use of public transport in favour of the private car will be temporary. Whether or not this is the case, the sheer growth in jobs guarantees yet more cars on the road. On my doorstep, where I'm sitting now, not on my doorstep, but outside my doorstep, the Cambridge Biomedical Campus is already committed to increase the number of its staff from 17,250 now to 26,000 by 2031, and up to 30,000 beyond then, plus many more hospital patients and visitors, with 2 new hospitals planned on the site. And this is only one of the 6 key districts in Cambridge. In the immediate future, the number of jobs in Cambridge may not grow at the same rate due to loss of some lower paid, insecure jobs in the hospitality sector in particular. This requires careful mitigation of the great distress it is causing, but should not last. And the higher paid added value jobs in the ICT and life sciences are buoyant and will continue to go apace. In the immediate future, the number of jobs in Cambridge the quality of life for all our citizens must not be sacrificed for yet more economic growth for the benefit of a relative few. Such growth in Greater Cambridge would also add to the decades-long neglect, and this is a very important point, to the decades-long neglect of the very areas in our county and country who rightly express strong resentment at their continued unfair exclusion from the high value-added economic growth they most need. Despite this, the high economic growth lobby assert as a matter of fact that all of the growth must be in Cambridge or nearby on the grounds of agglomeration. This is stated most audibly by the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Commission, set up and selected by Mayor James Palmer and the Combined Authority. The Commission's report, which astonishingly makes no mention of the environment, none at all, states boldly, Cambridge is at a decisive moment in its history where it must choose whether it wants to once again reshape itself for growth or let itself stagnate and wither. A dispersal strategy is unlikely to be successful as it is agglomeration that attracts companies to the area. I've searched for evidence to support this assertion and have found nothing conclusive so far. Wikipedia's entry on agglomeration denotes the lack of agreement on the assertion when it says, "This article has multiple issues, please help improve it." Nonetheless, its summaries of benefits and advantages is useful. It lists as benefits low transport costs, a great local market, a large supply of labour, and thus the increased chance of supply and demand for labour, particularly for specialists, to compensate for fast matching lower search costs. The accumulation of knowledge and human capital leads to knowledge spillovers between firms. Note that all of these benefits are for companies. The disadvantages it lists are strong environmental pressures, high land prices, bottlenecks in public goods, for example, poor and overburdened infrastructure, corruption, high competitive pressure, lack of reserve areas, economic inequality. Note that all the disadvantages are for communities, that is us. The disadvantages are familiar to us in Cambridge and to our South Cambridgeshire neighbours. And is it really the case that knowledge spillover depends fundamentally on physical proximity? It is clearly important to have some physical proximity as reported from the recent annual Berlin ICT conference by the BBC World Service, but surely not all day, every day. Home or remote working is also supportive of spillover, as long as there are occasions for human beings to relate to each other in person as well as online. Indeed, the Wikipedia entry supports the view that knowledge spillover occurs between individuals who are remote from each other, as well as those in close proximity. Looking further, I found a relevant South Korean study, which does not establish a strong case for industry agglomeration at our stage of the ICT life cycle. The study investigated knowledge production, this is a quote, in the information communication technology industry in the capital area around Seoul, and found that distinct patterns can be found depending on the industry life cycle. Leadership by large firms has positive effects on knowledge production during the growth stage, while its effects become insignificant during the maturity stage. This is in line with the expectations of evolutionary agglomeration theory. The effects of industrial diversity change from negative to insignificant as the ICT industry enters the maturity stage, which is where we are. In the meantime, competition always has positive effects, while localization has no significant effects. I have the reference to that study, which I will pass on. My search of the scant literature left me unconvinced that the case for agglomeration asserted so confidently by our independent economic commission had been made conclusively. Clearly, at a more fundamental level, we need to move rapidly away from the deep-seated view within most of us, as almost part of our DNA, that economic growth is an unmitigated good, because this is clearly not the case. It causes avoidable harm for the many, as well as benefit, particularly for the few. However, if a new direction is taken, it will take time. More immediately, there is an opportunity to change for the better, away from the remorseless push for boundless growth with its existential threat to our area. An opportunity through the Greater Cambridge Local Plan, which, as I've said, is under review. This allocates land for development over the next 20 years, strongly influences our surroundings, the place we live in and experience daily, things that are very important to us as individuals and communities. They are governed, that's local plans, are governed by restrictive national policy, but there is scope to shape the content of the new plan if, and it's a big if, there is the political will to do so in Cambridge City and South Cambridgeshire councils, which is in part down to us. Yet the first conversation document, which I've referred to, which started the review process, anticipates growth of at least 40,000, it's actually 41,000 on checking, by 40,000 additional homes by 2040. And if economic growth continues, that's a minimum figure, up to 66,700 additional homes. This could mean as many new homes in the next 20 years as were achieved in the previous 2,000. This is not acceptable and must change. The councils say they are not working to these figures, I quote, but their public commitment to high economic growth is seen by many to belie this. The call for sites, which is part of the statutory local plan process, has produced an unorderly queue of developers vying to get land designated for development in the new local plan, much of it in the green belt. For example, in my area, Trumpington, Grosvenor has bid to build 750 additional houses on greenbelt land, which would completely close the precious green space between the yet-to-be-completed Trumpington Meadows housing development and the M11. And alongside it, across Hawkston Road, Jesus College's plan to build an 85,000 square metre research/science park and 1,250 additional homes on 170 hectares of greenbelt land between Hawkston Road Addenbrooke's Road, and alongside the River Cam, stretching towards Great Shelford, with the obligatory new country park, of course. There are over 600 bids, many for large jobs and housing growth in both Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire. This is alarming. There is an impression on the part of some that making the case against rampant growth is letting down those who need good housing in Cambridge or close by. Our daughters and sons who cannot afford to live here and are commuting at great financial, social and personal cost. While I understand this concern, it misses the point. Unless jobs growth is curbed, the associated housing growth will not house those we care for, because housing supply is constantly playing catch-up. Purchase prices and rents continue to rise for that reason, including for more distant housing with its additional commuting costs. This makes it more difficult for local people, not less, with even more straitened resources as housing and travel costs continue to outstrip median incomes. The current local plan already provides for housing growth of 33,400 new homes by 2031, but this will not solve the housing difficulties of our people unless the jobs nettle is grasped. Better housing for our people in Greater Cambridge requires a significantly lower rate of jobs growth. It also, and this is an important aside, requires radical change in the housing market. On its own, increasing the housing supply does not produce truly affordable, secure, good quality housing for our people. Determined government intervention in the market is also required to change this. Through, for example, rent controls related to what people can afford, large investment in social housing, including a major mutualisation programme in both sectors of the housing market, sponsorship of major housing cooperatives, public benefit housing associations, and abolition of restrictive legislation such as the financial viability tests and the presumption for development, and so on. It requires an ambitious programme. Experience shows that without such measures, the private sector will not deliver. And I'm talking here about centuries of history, not decades. Given the incentives for shareholders to restrict housing supply and hold back land from development until prices rise. However, these policy means are not available to us at present, and we are obliged to act in the world as it is by taking what small steps we can, such as the funding for 500 new council houses, which Cambridge City Council secured from the devolution deal. But it is only 500, and the right to buy still applies. Restraining the rate of jobs growth is crucial if we are not to end up with the worst of all possible worlds, in which yet more Cambridge people are driven out of the place in which we work but cannot afford to live, or are crowded into the hutches for which planning applications are being made within Cambridge. And Cambridge's special character, which I've already referred to, is destroyed with a major loss of areas in Greater Cambridge's green belt. It may be an unfair question, but is it entirely coincidental that some of those who lobby hard for yet more economic growth are also active in Natural Cambridge initiatives? Is this partly to provide neatly organised green space in amongst the development? Perhaps a slightly jaundiced question, but not entirely unrealistic. At the same time as pressing hard for yet more jobs growth, the government is admitting, albeit in its customary Panglossian manner, that its United Nations biodiversity targets are being missed left, right and centre. To be precise, 85% of them, according to Phoebe Watson's report in a recent Guardian. Locally, there seems to be no guarantee that we will not run out of water, and our biodiversity remains under threat from modern agricultural methods and physical developments such as the planned Cambridge South Station, Clare College's desire to build more houses, which is reflected in the call for sites, and the proposed southern portal for the Cambridge Autonomous Metro, all of which are to a greater or lesser degree will have a detrimental effect on Trumpington's Green Corridor, one of the 4 into Cambridge. This is existentially serious. My report, Cambridge Growth Beyond Reason, predicts that unless there is a significant change of direction in our area, quotes, a perfect storm is brewing, with SS Greater Cambridge at full steam ahead, with a pilot, that shows my vintage by the way, with a pilot apparently determined to plot a course towards the gathering clouds just over the horizon, no matter what the size of the cresting waves ahead. We are being asked to sacrifice what we hold dear in the national economic interest. What is our answer? Is not this growth beyond reason? And whose place is Cambridge anyway? Does it belong to people who live here or the powers that be? A better future is possible for Cambridge and for our neighbours if we act to secure it. My report makes a dozen recommendations to help us get back some control over what we hold dear, to help prevent the imminent climate catastrophe, restrict out-of-control economic development while creating good, secure jobs elsewhere in more deprived areas as well as here, and provide decent and sustainable housing which we can afford, not too far away from work on affordable public transport, while also nurturing a sense of place and identity for the future which values what we are fortunate enough to have inherited from the past. Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you so much, David. Oh, sorry, I've got echo. Sorry about that. But thank you very much, David. That was brilliant. I think you've got an audience here who are very sympathetic to what you've been saying. I'm not going to say much more. I'm going to pass over to Nikki, who's been collecting some questions, and she'll share those with you.
Yeah, thank you, David, for that. I'll get straight into the questions and I'll just read them out. Thank you to everyone who put them in. David, if I can ask you to keep the answers to 2 to 3 minutes each, and then we can get through a few before we go into breakout rooms.
Sure.
Here's one from Ellie. She says, I've been looking at the consultation for North East Cambridge development, which is going to be 8,000 flats and businesses. And it talks about the need to increase the competitiveness of Cambridge's economy as if we're in some sort of race with other cities. She says, we don't understand this mentality. Can you explain where it comes from? Is it about attracting central government funding, or is it simply about trying to attract more private businesses?
Well, that sounds to me as though it's about attracting more private businesses. And I mean, this is it's a kind of game, you know. It's sorry, game is the wrong word. It's a kind of mental game that somehow we've got to repeat what we've done in the past in order to be effective and efficient in the future. You notice I didn't mention they're environmentally sound in the future. Now, I mean, some would argue that it's perfectly possible to achieve the goal of doubling our economic output without all this physical development. I'm not wholly sold on that argument as yet, but nevertheless, competitiveness, in the sense that we understand it, is not necessarily at the heart of that. Being more effective in the way we use resources is certainly at the heart of it. And certainly being more sustainable in our effects on the environment is critical to it. Green economic growth is critical to it. So I'm not sure what that phrase, I'd need to look into it, that phrase means in precise terms, but as you probably noticed by my body language, I'm immediately wary of it because it had a tinge of the zealotry which underlies the agglomeration argument. I didn't hold that view originally, by the way. I went into looking at the literature in my search in an open-minded way and came out with a very critical view So that's probably not on the money as far as Northeast Cambridge is concerned, but that's my reaction.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question is from Kerry, and you mentioned the biodiversity targets that we haven't met. And Kerry points out that with building on Greenbelt, this one doesn't match up with Boris Johnson's recent pledge to increase biodiversity to protect 30% of areas. And what can we do to change the national government's approach to long-term thinking on growth and biodiversity? And this links to Tony's question about how we can actually, what impact we can have to try and stop this growth or mitigate it.
I will refrain from extended comment on Boris Johnson's pledges, which seem to be a bit of a movable feast, and I'll talk about government in a longer term perspective. Successive governments, and more recently Conservative governments, have shown, I think, a disregard for biodiversity targets. And it is seen as sufficient, in a way, for development, economic development, to attract the obligatory biodiversity gain for a planning application and so on. But I think many in the Conservative Party, as elsewhere, would argue that really a more fundamental approach to the catastrophe that is facing us with the huge declines in biodiversity. And these responses range from jealous guardianship of the green spaces that we have been able to create, like the Trumpington Green Corridor, which I mentioned, one of 4 in Cambridge, which has a critical biodiversity purpose and which is designed in order to increase biodiversity and to save species, to preserve species which are under threat from the form of agricultural activity which takes place around us, out through my window here across Addenbrooks Road. And that is under threat, for example, from one of the developments I mentioned, which is Clare College's desire to build a lot of housing in Trumpington's Green Corridor. And if you look at the call for sites, a lot of them are located in areas which would directly damage our current programme of commitment to biodiversity. But at a more fundamental level, the declines in the hare population, for example, that I'm talking about, also threatened, by the way, by the Cambridge South Station. There is a population of hares in Hobson's Park, which is part of the environmental gain from the development in the south of Cambridge. That population, unless it is carefully looked after, will be damaged by the emergence of Cambridge South Station. At the central government level, I think it actually requires a rather more fundamental reorientation of thinking. In the last general election, there was some interesting discussion of a green industrial revolution, technological revolution. And I think it is there, as well as in physical development, as well as in the development of transport, it is there that effort needs to be put in order to not just clean up our act, but to produce a form of development that is good for the people, of jobs growth for the people, which actually improves our planet. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. So I'm going to pick one from Sue. who says, can we challenge the estimates for job growth in Cambridge, given all the other forthcoming changes, especially surrounding COVID, more people working from home and remotely, and also Brexit? Would this mean that fewer companies are going to come to Cambridge?
Yes, we can challenge it, and that in a way is, well, not in a way, it is what I'm doing. It's not a fact, you know, produced by the atmosphere around us. It is something which is coming out of the market. Jobs growth in Cambridge is predominantly market driven. It's not an inevitable fact. And as I've said, some part of the aspiration for higher added value jobs and for improving our overall economic output for good purpose, for good use, can be achieved by development elsewhere, in the very areas where it's not taking place, in the very areas where there are not the same pressures on the environment, and where it can be produced in a more sustainable form, in a more dispersed form. It requires some mental ingenuity in order to conceive such a future, but it is perfectly possible. As far as the practicalities here and now are concerned, we will be told by many that the local plan is governed by national policy, the National Policy, Physical Policy Framework, National Planning Policy Framework. And that is true, and that is what is, and the standard method which the government has, another algorithm, it's the standard method that it has for calculating the number of houses, the new house, additional houses, which need to be provided for in local plans. But that's a human product. There is a presumption of sustainable development underlying our national policy at the moment. This is not sustainable development. We have to persuade the councillors in the City Council and in South Cambridgeshire, we the people have to persuade them that a different future is possible. And it is possible. And it shouldn't be regarded as, you know, a Sisyphean task. This is something that can be achieved. I mean, otherwise I would not have set out on this road myself. And hence the value of talks, of discussions like this, which are a physical expression of the human spirit saying a different future is possible.
Great. Thank you for answering those questions, David.